Hello, I'm Yiwen Tang.
And I'm Owen Shelton.
Today we're going to give you a talk on what is disability by introducing 4 models of disability. Most of us would probably say disability is functional problem of certain body parts such as blindness and deafness. This kind of understanding of disability is based on medical or biomedical model of disability. This model perceives disability as the problem within individual. Under this model, the decreased life quality of disabled people is viewed as the result of various kinds of impairments of their bodies. So it proposes medical treatment and support to be the solutions for disability-related problems. Since this model casts disabled people as victims of their conditions, the sympathy followed by this directs social policies to focus on compensating the disabled. Generally this model perceives disability as something abnormal and inferior. So as a result, it receives a lot of rejection from disabled people because it leads to low self-esteem, poor education, underemployment, and most importantly, social segregation. Now let's move to our next model, social model of disability. Social model perceives disability just as a type of individual difference. So the social inequality and disadvantages that disabled people experience are not caused by their physical impairments, but the society's failure of providing them with accommodation. Therefore, to alleviate social inequalities, social model argues that public policy should focus on lowering unnecessary social barriers that faced by the disabled. One good example of this kind of policy would be student support card introduced by 2 British medical schools in 2006 and 2007. The card provides students with reasonable adjustments under any situation, and it receives very positive evaluation among disabled students. It was perceived as a way of empowering them to request the support. So overall, compared to medical model, social model approaches disability in a completely different way, since it claims that disability is a problem with society instead of individual.
So far we've looked at 2 extreme points of view as to who is to blame for the disability. We have the biomedical model that looks at the individual and what is going on with their body. And then we have the social model that looks at the environment around them and evaluates how well the person is being accommodated. Well, the International Classification of Functioning integrates and notices that both of those points of view are valid and tries to have some leeway to alleviate the disability at both ends, because you have a biological condition which will lead to a physical impairment, and that physical impairment will limit the person from being able to participate in certain activities. Now, you can nip it in the bud at the biological condition level, perhaps giving someone a cochlear implant so that they are able to hear. Or you can look at the environment that they are in and perhaps give closed captioning to a deaf student who is taking classes at the university level. Next, you have the capability model, and we are going to try to apply that to disability. There are 2 things that we look at with the capability model. We look at the individual's well-being and their advantage. Their well-being being how well is their being. Are they living without malaria? Do they have access to food and water? Are they able to go on every type of transportation that there is in their certain town or city? And then we have the advantage, which is their freedom of opportunities, which looks at how many different opportunities do they have as opposed to just how are they living right now. To really illustrate this difference, we can have two people who are starving, but one person is observing religious practices and may have a good steak dinner sitting in the refrigerator, but they're abstaining from it. But then you could also have someone who's in poverty and could really go for a ham sandwich right now, but does not have the means or the money to be able to access it. And when you apply that to disability, there are certain disabilities that will limit someone's function, but that limited function does not get in the way of and interfere what that person wants to do and achieve, and they don't really, under the capability of model, we don't consider that an actual disability unless the physical impairment is interfering with what the person wishes to accomplish with their life. So we have looked at 4 different ways of defining disability, and we hope that you will take these definitions into consideration as you listen to the rest of our presentations. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Becca.
Hi, I'm Molly, and today we're going to have a presentation on what disabilities have to do with diversity. Today we're going to be using the words diversity and disability quite a lot, and we just want to make sure that you know what definitions we're using. Today, diversity means any dimension that can be used to differentiate groups of people from one another. Disability is any limitation that is physical, sensory, cognitive, or emotional.
So we have some statistics for you that'll shed light on the whole issue of whether disability is a diversity factor or not. The disability community makes up 20% of the United States population, making them a very large and somewhat unrecognized minority. Of these people in the disability community, only 41% of individuals with disabilities are employed, as compared to 79% employment with people without disabilities. Furthermore, we'll be discussing learning disabilities later in this presentation, and 41% of the United States population identifies with having a learning disability. And of these individuals with learning disabilities, only 10% continue to college after graduating from high school within 2 years of graduating. And a lot of them go in not knowing the accommodations that are available to them as individuals with learning disabilities.
Having established that disability is diversity, we must also consider the role that disability plays in discrimination. Pat McCune sheds light on the unrecognized discrimination against students with disabilities on college campuses. Particularly, he collected student reports of students with learning disabilities on campus. One student reported, "I feel as though all people with disabilities make up some sort of culture. I mean, we share many of the same experiences, many of the same problems, and same issues." It is important to note that all people with disabilities are a minority and are often not recognized as one. Furthermore, Pat McCune states that instructors, perhaps out of ignorance, anxiety, or a misguided sense of fairness, refuse to provide accommodations and often humiliated their students publicly discussing their needs.
So as Molly mentioned before, this discrimination occurs on college campuses, but it also can be seen in the workforce. So to prevent this discrimination against individuals with disabilities, whether cognitive or physical or sensory, awareness of these types of disabilities is very important to human resource professionals as well as employers. This awareness in the different types of disability will hopefully result in an increase in diversity in the workforce. Furthermore, awareness of accommodations to individuals with disabilities will make these individuals feel more comfortable and able to work to their fullest when at work. The full inclusion and accommodation of individuals with disabilities will in turn give any workplace a richness of perspectives and an increase in diversity.
Disabilities in general seem to have a negative connotation in the workforce, as Becca just discussed. However, they equally have negative stereotypes on college campuses. Particularly those with physical disabilities report feeling like they are already stereotyped as being intellectually inferior by their physical appearances. However, learning disabilities, which are not always physically apparent, are often seen as somehow a hoax, a trick to gain the upper hand in the classroom because of the extra accommodations they receive. When in reality, it is important that these individuals are not nervous or scared that they are going to get this stereotype, but instead are willing to get the help that they need. The most common response to studies show that the most common response to a meta-stereotype of a student with learning disabilities is a lower ability or is a lower ability of intelligence. We have to make sure as a community that this is not ever a stereotype that is on our campus.
In conclusion, action is absolutely necessary to enhance diversity. This action would include the inclusion of individuals with disabilities, whether on college campuses or in the workforce, as well as the accommodation of their needs without making those negative stereotypes. And these sorts of actions will make huge contributions to the dialogue on diversity and discrimination against the minorities that may have been previously unexplored.
Thank you so much for your time today.
Hi, I'm Kirsten Dusinger.
And I'm Emily Dean.
And we're going to talk to you about Equal Opportunities Act and the revealing of hidden disabilities. So we define disability as the limitation in the ability to pursue an occupation because of physical or mental impairment. And as you can see to the bottom right side of the slide, we have 4 different images of the visual physical disabilities that are, sometimes known as most common. The Equal Opportunities Act prohibits employment and disability discrimination against qualified individuals with disabilities by employers with 15 or more employees and by public entities, including public colleges and universities, whether or not they receive federal financial assistance.
And there are some disabilities that are not immediately apparent. We're going to call these invisible disabilities or hidden disabilities. The 2 terms can be used interchangeably. Some common examples are central auditory processing disorder. This can be thought of as a learning disorder. It's when a person has difficulties paying attention, difficulties listening and interpreting what a person has to say. Often they have to look right at the person that's talking to them to be able to even begin to interpret what they're saying to them. There are also various levels of hearing impairments. Many people don't know that there's a lot of steps in between completely being able to hear and being completely deaf. And then there are also some visual impairments, such as these on the following slide. So here are 4 types of visual impairments and what the world might look like to people with these visual impairments. Then these people then have a choice of whether or not they want to reveal that they have a disability when they're being interviewed or when they're being trained for employment. They have certain advantages and disadvantages that they have to consider. So advantages may include proper accommodations. If they do indeed reveal that they have a disability, they can receive accommodations in the workplace that can make life a lot easier for them. Also, if they ever have poor performance, this won't be misattributed to laziness or other similar factors. And some employers actually view disabled persons as a top hiring priority, perhaps because it makes the company look good, or perhaps because it is the right thing to do to give these people an equal opportunity. Disadvantages that may come up: there is a potential to ruin the chances of being hiring if the employer did in fact have a bias. There may be stigma and pity that come from coworkers, and that can be uncomfortable or unwanted in the workplace. There is the worry that employers will think they're only revealing their disability in attempts to gain an advantage over other people who are being considered for the job. Additionally, it is difficult to discriminate when to reveal and when not to reveal that they have a disability, just because there are so many different settings in which it is appropriate to reveal and so many settings when it's not appropriate or not necessary.
Okay, so as you can see in this figure, it's a profile of whales, and in the top right corner, the green chart, it notes that the 14.3% of the population are disabled or are work-limiting disabled, and in the bottom left corner, the blue chart, there's an 8.2% total percentage of the population that are unemployed. And so from all this knowledge, we propose a study to be performed. So we decided we would provide a survey and ask how disabled employees came across their job and how successful they were and how they overcame such barriers. And from a related search, we found out that by friend and contacts or word of mouth, it was the most successful way to hear of a job opportunity. So in that same study, related results were the related results from primary barriers were employee attitude, the transportation to the location of the interview, the accommodations, and lack of jobs. And they also found that successful employment came from networking and not delivery services such as online resources. And more jobs were achieved through personal efforts rather than agency assistance. So these findings may encourage policy changes for the blind when looking for employment, and to start this, we decided using public awareness to let a larger population know about the employer responsibilities would be the most beneficial. So in conclusion, we decided that these findings may provide the blind community with the knowledge they need to make their decision easier as to whether or not they should share their hidden disability or not, and as to whether, and when applying for these employments, if they should withhold it. But this could apply for all disabilities and not just the blind population.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Harshada, this is Priyala, and we're here to present on stigmatizing disability. As you know, it's an unfortunate truth of today's world that stigma is present everywhere. It might be a unique revelation to some of you that even within stigma there are different types, and people often prefer one over the other, as awkward as that sounds. So there was a study done by Albrecht et al. In 1982, and they hypothesized that there were these two different types of stigma, deviance and disability. Deviance is a deviation from social norms. It's usually a social condition, whereas disability is an actual physical difference, which is often functionally incapacitating as well. To test this, they took a list of 27 different stigmatizing conditions and ran a factor analysis on them, and the results gave 4 main types of stigma. Group 1 had severe, visible, and disabling conditions such as paraplegia or amputation. Group 2 had mainly the deviance type of conditions such as mental illness, drug addiction, alcohol addiction, etc. Group 3 had visible but not functionally impairing conditions such as acne, scars, melanoma, and the 4th group had very medically serious but not visible conditions like cancer or asthma that usually get worse as age progresses. After they found their 4 different types of stigma, they also ran these, correlated these 4 types against the mean social distance from people with these conditions, and the results of their correlational study showed that people perceived the greatest social distance from those who had the group 2 type of disability, that is social deviance such as mental illness, drug or alcohol addiction, etc. And you can see that people with mental illness would then suffer the brunt of this social disruption. For a second, if we view this from the point of view of the people with mental disabilities, their struggle becomes twofold. For one, they have to deal with the disability itself, and for two, they have to deal with the stigma that other people put on it. As you can see in this image, this artist is struggling not only with the disease, but with shame. That's a social stigma that's placed on it. Based on this, I also found another study by Corrigan and Watson in 2002, which looked at the effect of stigma on work. And they came up with a very disturbing result. They found that there's a vicious cycle that goes on with the people with mental illnesses. First of all, they have their psychiatric disability, which they struggle with. And as we have seen, this psychiatric disability puts a social stigma on them. This social stigma usually leads to prejudice, which then leads to discrimination and leads to unemployment. A long period of unemployment then would cause the most dangerous of them all, that is self-stigma. This is dangerous because in addition to people putting stigma on them, these people are stigmatizing and discriminating against themselves. Considering that this is a mental illness, chances are great that it probably worsens their psychiatric disability and this cycle continues. The way I see it, the only place that we can actually stop this cycle would be social stigma. That would be up to us to do. And now Briella is going to tell you about why this social stigma occurs.
Okay, so as Harshita was just discussing, we do know that stigma against the disabled definitely is something that is very real. And so the same paper by Albrecht et al. From 1982 looked into why it is that the stigma exists. So based on how participants answered, they found that the reason for social distance from the disabled was due to a fear of social disruption. So to further break that down, they found that the majority by far, so 82.8% of the participants, said this was because of the general ambiguity of the situation, meaning a general awkwardness of not knowing how to interact with someone who was disabled. Another 7% said it was because of guilt or pity. 4.7% said a threat to social well-being. 3.9% said a physically offensive reaction to the disabled, and 1.6% said they felt a threat to physical well-being. To go along further with that, they also assessed the social distance, so in other words, the stigma against those who had medically severe yet not visible disabilities such as cancer or heart disease or asthma, as Harshita talked a little bit about, and they, in comparison to those with deviant qualities or disabilities, and they found that people most often associated with those who had these severe yet not visible disorders. So this suggests a connection between visible conditions and stigma. So this is a cartoon by a British handicapped artist, Crippen, and I think this very well illustrates the stigma of, I don't know how well you can see this, but they're asking, do you think they take sugar? And this is a group of disabled people. So instead of simply asking as you would to anyone, they have that fear of just the awkwardness of how not to interact in this situation. Another study by Goldstein and Johnson in 1997 assessed how far the stigma reaches based on those who associate with the disabled. So they interviewed college students about the perceptions of an able-bodied person who is dating someone who is physically disabled. And they found significant results that college students likely viewed the able-bodied partner as someone who was trustworthy and nurturing, but they also were less likely to view them as athletic, sociable, or intelligent. So that suggests that our stigma reaches far beyond those who are disabled, which is bad enough. So we have reason to believe that a lot of stigma is subconscious, so it is important just to be aware of the stigma that you may or may not realize that you have. So remember to check your stigma. And
Hi, I'm Jenny.
Hi, I'm June, and we're here to present the ethical implications of prenatal screening. So, one of the articles that we read for this, one of the first articles that we read for this presentation was A World of Their Own by Lisa Mundy. And the main issue that we thought was very interesting to both of us was the concept of a designer baby. Basically, what this means is that parents and individual state have a concept of what traits do you want your children to have and what can you do to achieve that. In the past, it was really difficult for parents to actually have any sort of control over the types of traits that their children would exhibit. But advances in technology like genetic screening and computer programs that increase the likelihood that a sperm donor would give you a specific phenotype, your child a specific phenotypic quality, have increased that chances and have actually given parents a semblance of control over it. And in the story itself, Sharon and Candy, two deaf parents, were denied by the sperm bank company because they wanted to find a donor who exhibited congenital deafness. And that sort of, then they denied that to them because it sort of raised ethical implications of, do you want your child to be impaired or deaf? But to us, it kind of just raises the larger societal question. What does society at large want to do? And the general answer to that question is that it's to endow their children with phenotypic qualities or characteristics that they want. Basically, every parent that we've ever known, or would-be parent that we've ever known, has a kind of shopping list of what they would want their children to be. Some parents want to control the sex of their child. Some want their child to exhibit certain physical characteristics like height, eye color, muscle development, and most recently in this case, it's whether or not they exhibit qualities that would be considered disabilities or not. But that's more or less a normative question rather than an objective question to ask. Oops. And the basic implications of this are that although the majority of individuals who would make use of this type of technology, prenatal screening and actually like genetic engineering and such, would be that there is the potential for misuse. Although the majority of individuals would probably be just well-intentioned, I want my child to be healthy, I want my child to be happy in the environment that he's going to grow up in. But the fact is that current US law doesn't contain any explicit clauses that concern technology and its moral use in society. And if it does, morality clauses are rarely utilized by the US patent and trademark offices on how things like genetic engineering and prenatal screening would be used to try to shape the way humans are made.
Okay, so bringing this a little bit back into the realm of prenatal screening, one of the most common methods of prenatal screening is using an ultrasound, and some of the main things that are screened for during this process would be Down syndrome, trisomy 13 and 18, and spina bifida, and these are all chromosomal abnormalities that take place during the process of development that could cause complications to a birth, to the fetus, and to the child once and after they're born. So with this idea of prenatal screening, it has brought about the concept of parental choice, whether the parent decides to terminate the pregnancy because they are found for having a positive trait for a characteristic abnormality, or to continue this pregnancy, whether they were found negative or whether they were found positive for this. And a study was done where a group of women who went through prenatal screening and were found to have a fetus with characteristics of trisomy 13 or 18 was done. These women were the group of women who decided to continue on with their pregnancy, and they were asked reasons for why they decided to do so. A lot of these, the majority of the reason had to do with issues of morality. It also had to do with parent-centered reasons, child-centered reasons, and religion and reasons of practicality. The largest reason, which was moral beliefs were either individual beliefs or they were religious beliefs, and many women expressed comments such as they felt that the child was an individual. They had already referred to the child by their own name, and they also just expressed reasons for it was meant to be. This was something that was not in their control, religious factors, that God was the only one who could take away life. And these were some of the main reasons that women decided to continue on with the pregnancy. And during this time, they were often told from healthcare providers that their infant would probably most often be a stillbirth, or they could even miscarry. And even with these diagnoses, women reported having a more fulfilling family, and feelings of their family was kind of brought together even after the birth and even death of this child. And some of the parents reported during this study that they were told by healthcare providers things that were not very supportive during the pregnancy and things they believed may have been inaccurate, such as their child would likely die before birth, their child would not live more than a few months, and that the condition that they were continuing a pregnancy with was lethal or even incompatible with life. And these kind of express a need for the healthcare providers to be more informed and possibly have more training during going through med school on how to handle interactions with parents who decide to continue on with a child who's going to possibly have an abnormal or something that's considered a disability within society. There's a need for more knowledge about how to interact with them and provide more support. And even in the case whether the parent is deciding to screen in a disability, whether they're deciding to screen out a disability, or whether they even decide to continue on with a birth that could possibly be dangerous to themselves or the infant, there just needs to be a general consensus of support from the healthcare industry. Thank you for listening to our presentation.
Hi, I'm Naomi.
And I'm Elise.
And we'll be presenting on Deaf President Now. Gallaudet is a university for deaf students founded in 1864 in Washington, D.C. Until 1897, all presidents of Gallaudet were hearing presidents. However, after the resignation of Jerry C. Lee in 1987, students and faculty protested the Board of Trustees' decision to select a hearing president as the head of university. This set of protests were called Deaf President Now. Despite great opposition, Elizabeth Zinsser, a hearing president, was selected. But after 5 days, Zinsser resigned due to protesters' claims that the school had doubts about the deaf community having equal abilities and achieve as much as hearing community. The 4 demands stated by the protesters were the resignation of Zinsser, the resignation of Jane Bassett Spillman, chair of Board of Trustees, and the reconstitution of Board of Trustees with 51% of its members being deaf, and also that there should be no reprisals against any students involved in the protests. However, even after the deaf president, King Jordan, was appointed, students felt that there were still issues that needed to be addressed. Following Deaf President Now, another protest erupted in 2006 out of a deep cultural anxiety about radical changes made by medical and technological advances, such as cochlear implants that offer deaf people opportunities to become immersed into the hearing world, rather than in a separate culture revolving around American Sign Language. These protests were based on issues including resistance to racism and paternalism, and a lack of shared governance and administrative transparency. There was also great controversy surrounding language, since due to implants and focus on English language, not everyone had the needed produced sign language. All students at Gallaudet are expected to write college-level English essays. However, many of their teachers could not even produce elementary sign language. The bigger issue represented by the 2 protests in Gallaudet is identity politics and exclusivity of the deaf community. Gallaudet is seen as the Mecca for the deaf community and is the highest institution for the deaf in terms of authority and legitimacy. The fact that this haven for the deaf is ambiguous in terms of their language policies stirred conflicting emotions in students and faculty. With this, the school created a model of inclusive bilingualism in which ASL and English language were both promoted, meaning even those with cochlear implants would learn ASL and vice versa. This educates students to become bilingual scholars who are able to communicate with a wide array of people, hearing, partially hearing, or deaf.
In March and April of 2013, Gallaudet celebrated the 25th anniversary of Deaf President Now. The first 3 deaf presidents served on a panel. The first 3 deaf presidents since the historical civil rights movement in 1988 spoke on a panel during the celebration to discuss the event, its impact on the deaf community, and the continuing challenges the school faces today. Not only do they serve as the CEO and leader of Gallaudet, but they also become a symbol of the deaf community. King Jordan faced the brunt of this publicity since he was the first deaf president in the history of education. The future plans discussed by the current president, Alan Hurwitz, make Gallaudet sound like any other institution. The protests of 1988 and 2006 put Gallaudet in the forefront of deaf education, and they continue to be a leader. The second largest deaf college, the National Technical Institute for the Deaf, part of Rochester Institute of Technology's campus, did not have their first deaf president until 1996. However, the Gallaudet continues to face challenges associated with integrating deaf education into a hearing society. The deaf presidents have all faced extremely high expectations and doubt in their abilities to run an institution. The campus still struggles with accreditation issues, bad press, and the division of students based on the lack of trust that led to the protests in 2006. All of these issues are issues of integrating a minority community into a majority population. Another situation in which conflict arose when a minority was appointed as a representative of a school within a specific community occurred in 2008 when Morehouse College, a historically black college, nominated their first white valedictorian, Joshua Packwood. Many distinctive African American alumni have graduated from this institution, including Martin Luther King Jr. This was the first time in history a white male took the position of valedictorian. Many alumni were frustrated by the naming of a white male as their representative because they felt that this institution was created to highlight the success of African Americans as a minority population. However, the situation was cooled when the institution released a statement that they were proud to have educated a Morehouse man independent of his color. In contrast to DPN, Morehouse had always been represented by one of themselves, whereas Gallaudet had only been represented by the hearing. And in the end, the Morehouse case was seen as a step towards changing race relations. Both of these cases exemplify situations in which minorities stand up to request ownership of their community, and in both cases take a progressive step towards becoming more competitive in modern education.
Thank you.